It's time for us to add Google Places autocomplete to our header. Its job is pretty simple. It accepts a city name as an input, and as you type, it will search for cities that match and offer suggestions. Once you've made a selection, we'll use its return data to redirect you to a new geo search page where we'll show you information about properties nearby. The way Google Places autocomplete works is you pass it a reference to an input box, and the library fills it with all the functionality needed to search. That's pretty slick. All right, just a heads up. From now on, I'm just going to say autocomplete because saying Google Places autocomplete every time is going to drive me nuts. Anyway, since autocomplete is part of Google Maps integration, we'll be adding the functionality to our Maps plugin. Let's add a new function called make autocomplete and give it a parameter called input. This will be a reference to the input element that autocomplete will mount into. Just like what we did with show map, let's create an if statement checking if the map is loaded or not. And if it's not, push the function call to our waiting array. Next, we'll hop back into the docs and copy the code needed to create an autocomplete instance. I've left a link for you in the description. We're just going to scroll down a while. Here we are. This is what we need. So I'm going to copy this and paste it right here. Let's make it a constant and remember to add window to the Google object since we're in the context of a plugin. And for consistency, let's make a camel case. All right, notice autocomplete takes the input I mentioned before, but also an options parameter. As the name implies from the example, it's an object of options. Let's update it to be an object. By default, autocomplete matches addresses as you type. That's much too granular and confusing for our application. We only need to show cities. For this, autocomplete has an option called types. It's an array of string values that describe the allowable entities to show. Its syntax is a little weird, so bear with me. Add a property called types with the value of an array. Inside that array, type this. Great. Now we'll only be suggesting cities as you type. For more information about other options, feel free to check out the link I left in the lesson description. Since we made our init Google Maps function generic, there's nothing else to do there. This new function will be automatically called if Google isn't ready. Now let's add make autocomplete to our inject at the top so pages can actually use it. Okay, that should be good for now. Now let's add this to our header so we can test it out. Open up your default layout. Since autocomplete needs an input, let's create one under our home link and make it type text. We'll need a way to pass this input to our make autocomplete function, so let's add a ref called city search. Next, let's add a mounted function so we can attach our autocomplete client side in the browser. Now, just call our new make autocomplete function from our Maps plugin and pass it our city search reference. And save. By now, we should have enough to test this. Open your browser to our project and start typing a city into the input field. It's alive! Next up, let's wire up the event so that once you select a city, we actually do something. Let's head on over to our Maps plugin and update our make autocomplete function. We need to know when someone has selected something in the autocomplete dropdown. Since we don't control that functionality, we need to listen for an event that the control emits called place changed. At the end of our function, let's add a listener to autocomplete using the add listener method. This listens for an event using a name. Whenever the matching event is fired, it runs a callback function with whatever data the event was passed. That listener takes two arguments. The first is the name of the event to listen to. In our case, it's place changed. The second argument is a callback function. We'll just use an anonymous function. Great. So now whenever someone selects something in the autocomplete, our anonymous function will fire. Now, this event is pretty basic. It doesn't pass any data to our event handler. It just kind of shouts, "Hey, something changed." It's our job to fetch the place data ourselves. For that, we'll use a method called getPlace off of the autocomplete object. GetPlace returns a bunch of information about the currently selected destination, including latitude and longitude coordinates. What if you typed in something that wasn't autocompleted and hit enter? In that case, getPlace would just return an object with a single property called name with whatever you typed. Inside our anonymous function, create a constant called place and assign it to an autocomplete's getPlace method. Next, we need a way to push this rich information into viewland. We could just have passed a callback to our make autocomplete function and pass that the place information whenever it was fired, but that didn't really seem very viewy. Yes, I just made up that word. Instead, we should emit an event of our own directly on the input element we were given. That way, we can listen for events in the template, just like components. For this, we'll need to use dispatch event on the input element we get passed to our function. Dispatch event emits an event on an element object. Let's do that now. It takes a single argument, an event object. Since we want to send a special payload to our template, we'll be using the custom event object instead of the regular event object. It takes two parameters. The first one is the name of the event. Let's call it changed. The second parameter is the object we want to initialize the custom event with. Since we just want to send a payload with our event, we'll be using a special property called detail. It's not included in the traditional event object and lets us pass our place data to our listeners. Add an object with a property called details with the value of place. And let's save. Perfect. Now we just need to listen for this event in our template. Let's head on over to our layout. Alright, so let's wire up this new event. In our input, listen for the changed event and pass it a method called change. Next, let's create the changed method and give it a parameter of event. Now we have to extract our original event data, create a constant called place, and assign it to event.detail. Remember, there is a chance that place could be nowhere, so let's check for the geometry property, and if it doesn't exist, just return. Alright, so now the only thing we have to do is push the user to a new page and pass the latitude, longitude, and label so we can use them to display results in the area. To create a URL and push the user to a new page, we'll be using this $router. It's available in all components and is the instance of viewRouter. We'll be using the push method. It can take a string or an object. We'll be using the object form since we have a bunch of stuff to add to the URL. Add a router push using an empty object. Next, we have to tell it what page we're going to be pushing to, so it knows how to construct the URL. Add a property called name with the value of search. We'll be passing latitude, longitude, and the label using a query string. That's the question mark you usually see in the URL, followed by name value pairs. Add a property called query with the value of an object. Next, we need to add our latitude and longitude properties. Their value comes from the place geometry property we just checked for earlier. Let me show you. Here's a geometry object we got from our place object. Geometry has two properties, and we want the location. Here, we want the latitude and longitude. Notice they're actually function calls. Okay. Inside the query object, add a property called lat for latitude, and pass it the full object path we just saw. Now do the same thing for longitude. Next, we need to pass the URL a label. This will help users identify what they're seeing so they know what general area they're looking at. Add a property called label and pass it the value of our city search reference. And let's save. Alright, let's create a bare bones search page so this doesn't blow up. In your Pages folder, create a new file called search.view. Let's add a template section with a div. Inside the div, let's output $route.query. Route contains information about the current route, and query is an object containing each of our parameters and their values. And let's save. Now let's search for a city. This is working great! And this is just a tip of the iceberg for Google Places Autocomplete. It has a ton of options and is flexible enough for a wide variety of applications. Next up, let's add more functionality to our new search page.